Welcome to the 51st Foundation Day of the Center for Development Studies. And last year we celebrated our 50th foundation year. As you know, CDS was established on this October 19th, 1970. And since yesterday was a public holiday here, that's why we are having it on October 20th. And two pleasant things are going to take place now. First, we have a prize distribution for our best outgoing students from our MA batch. This is the 2019-21 MA batch. And after that, we have the Foundation Day lecture by Professor Ashwini Deshpande. So first we will have a very brief prize distribution, and thereafter I will introduce Professor Ashwini Deshpande, and then we will have the Foundation Day lecture. And I must also very warmly welcome Professor Ravi Kanpur, who has joined us from Ithaca in Cornell in the United States. He is the benefactor of two of these prizes, which these youngsters are going to receive right now. And so we are extremely grateful to Professor Ravi Kanpur and his family for instituting these two prizes. As you know, one of the prizes is the M.G. Kanpur Prize. Professor M.G. Kanpur is actually the father of Professor Ravi Kanpur. But much more importantly, he was the first econometrician of India. He worked at the Delhi School of Economics for a very brief period and thereafter at the University of Birmingham. And he used to be a visitor to the Center for Development Studies in the late 1970s. And he was a close friend and well-wisher of CDS, and specifically from Professor K.N. Raj. So Professor Ravi Kanpur, a few years ago, became the first Professor K.N. Raj Memorial Professor instituted by the Reserve Bank of India. And the entire prize money that he got, he donated it to the center to establish these prizes. So the first prize, which is the M.G. Kanpur Prize, is given to the best outgoing students who have topped the Center for Development Studies in the econometric courses. In the quantitative courses, which is basically three subjects: econometrics, statistics, and mathematics. And all these three subjects are in the first year of the program, in the first semester and in the second semester. And in the 2019-21 batch, this prize is going to be shared by two youngsters, Mr. Albert Abraham and Mr. Tejesh Mukherjee. Mr. Albert Abraham is based here in Kerala, and Tejesh is based in Calcutta. Okay, so they are the recipients of the 2019-21 M.G. Kanpur Prize. Now, the prize money is already in their bank account. And I must say that it is a very handsome prize. And thanks again to the very fine benefaction by Professor Ravi Kanpur. Okay, and the next prize is given to the best outgoing student overall, who has topped in all the subjects in the two-year master's program. This is actually the 8th batch of our new program in MA in Applied Economics. And this prize has again gone to Albert Abraham. And this prize is also, this prize was initially based on the royalties of two of the books of John Robinson, which Professor John Robinson herself instituted at the center. And the two books are Selected Economic Writings by John Robinson, published by Oxford University Press, and Introduction to Modern Economics by John Robinson and Eatwell. Now, this prize amount, of course, was a very small amount, and this has been topped up by Professor Ravi Kanpur. And in fact, I must say that this is one of the best prizes available here. And I can see that all the 7 prize winners are either doing their PhDs abroad or have completed their PhD, just about completing their PhD and joining the research arena. Okay, so this is a very prestigious prize, and we can see that all the prize winners whom we have selected have done exceedingly well in their future careers as well. So we expect both Albert Abraham and also MG Kanpur to do the same. And maybe we'll ask Ravi to speak a few words, and then Ashwini also to speak a few words.
Well, thank you indeed, Sunil, and it was a great honor to institute these prizes. When I was visiting the CDS as the KN Raj National Fellow, and been very pleased with the awards and the trajectory of the winners of the awards. So thank you very much indeed to the CDS for making this possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ravi, for those kind words. And I will now introduce Professor Ashwini Deshpande, who is our chief guest for the foundation. And as you know, we normally invite our distinguished alumni or the well-wisher of CDS. And Ashwini, I think, falls into the latter category of being a well-wisher of CDS. She's professor of economics at the Ashoka University and is also the founding director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at the Ashoka University. Her areas of specialization is basically economics of discrimination and affirmative action with a focus on gender and caste. And she has also worked on social identity and economic outcomes, specifically in labor market outcomes, self-employment, early childhood development, and education. Previously, she has worked on international debt and aspects of the Chinese economy. Now, her PhD is from the Delhi School of Economics, and she has done postdoctoral research at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the US. And currently, she is a professor of economics and also the founder and director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. Now, Professor Ashwini Deshpande has published exceedingly well and she has two single-authored books, both of which have been published by the Oxford University Press. The first book is Affirmative Action in India. It was published in 2013. And in 2011, she published a book called The Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India. She has 5 edited volumes to her credit, and the latest book, which is just being published by Springer, is a handbook on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action. And she has several journal articles. I don't need to read out all these articles here. There are a large number of them. And she has written also in the popular press and many op-ed pieces, blogs, etc., and so on. So, Ashwini, I think a very warm welcome to CDS. It's a pity that we are not able to have you in person here, but soon enough we will be opening up. Things are getting better here in Kerala. So we hope that in the year 2022, we will have the privilege of hosting you at our center. And she's going to speak to us on a topic of extreme current importance, in which CDS faculty have also contributed. It is titled Dropping Out, Being Pushed Out or Can't Get In, Decoding Declining Labor Force Participation of Indian Women. So we look forward to Ashwini's lecture on this topic. And the floor is yours, Ashwini. You can go for about an hour or so.
Thank you very much, Professor Mani, for inviting me to this very, very important lecture. It's an honor and a privilege. And as you say, it would have been absolutely amazing if I could have actually come there myself. But unfortunately, the COVID situation has ruined, so many of our plans over the last year and a half. And we should be fortunate at least that we are meeting even if virtually, because there's been unspeakable tragedy as a result of COVID all over the world. So, we in that context, I guess, even the fact that we are speaking virtually is a blessing. Having said that, I will absolutely be delighted to accept your invitation for coming sometime next year, whenever time permits. I would also like to congratulate the winners of the 2 prizes. And it's great to see Professor Ravi Kanpur here. It's very early in the morning for him, but it's excellent that he could join the meeting. And it's absolutely fabulous that he's instituted these prizes that encourage young students to do so well. And it's really heartening to see that the previous recipients of these prizes have gone on to make great contributions in the field. So with these few words, let me start by going into my presentation. Can someone confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see your.
All right. I don't know why this panel thing is showing up. So this is my talk is primarily based on a new paper that I have with my PhD student at Ashoka, Jitendra Singh. And this is the title, slightly modified title of that paper. But because this is a Foundation Day lecture, I decided that in addition to presenting the main results of the paper, I also like to give a little context and address some of the other work also that I've been doing on women's labor force participation. So the lecture is going to be slightly more broad-based than just the results of one paper. So to provide some context, and I'm sure everybody in the audience is familiar with this, but it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves that India is a part of a phenomenon in South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa regions, which has seen particular challenges as far as raising female labor force participation is concerned. So on the left-hand side, you see a graph from a website called Our World in Data, which is run by Oxford University. And you see very clearly the light pink region, which has consistently shown low female labor force participation rates. And that's really the MENA and South Asia regions. On the right-hand side, you see changes in labor force participation rates by sex and by region and by year. And whereas you see the increase for females in practically all the regions, you see the gender gap sort of worsening in some sense in the South Asia and Latin America, MENA region. And this has puzzled people, and the focus currently in the international community, in the popular literature, is to focus a lot on social norms. So the argument that there are particularly conservative or particularly restrictive social norms that are specific to this region, and that patriarchy takes a particularly severe form in this region, and that is why you see these gaps that are persistent. And indeed, there are several things about South Asia that are particular to the region, and I'm going to talk about some of them. But I want to open up this question a little bit and urge all of us to think about what the possible factors or explanations could be about that explain this particular pattern. So, when it comes to, for example, the social norms of the male breadwinner model, which is that it's the man's responsibility to earn the main livelihood earnings, for the family, and women should basically be taking care of domestic chores and children, etc. And to stay at home and take care of the family versus going out and earning a living. You see that the Arab states, South Asia, Northern Africa, so the MENA and the South Asia region that I was talking about earlier, these regions do lead in these beliefs. And this is not just this one survey, but there are many data points in the world that confirm this, that these norms are particularly strong in our region. So that's something to think about. However, the story is a little more complicated, as I hope to persuade you today at the end of the lecture. So when you come to India now and think of women's women's labor force participation or participation in economic activities, there are actually two related but distinct issues. One is the low level of recorded female labor force participation that has been low for decades. So even at its highest, it didn't even reach ever 40%. It was maximum, depends on which the data set is, but maximum has been between 33 to 35, 36% is the highest that I have seen. But that's pretty low as well. So it's really barely more than 1 in 3 women that supposedly are in the labor force. And the other issue is the decline, which is roughly last 2 decades. Now, the social norms argument has come into fore with greater force when it comes to the decline issue. So the belief is that over the last few years, we've seen a resurgence of conservative attitudes and values, and that has somehow, or an increase in sexual violence, and that is pushing women into the home and keeping them out of the labor force, that either they don't themselves want to work, or their family members or communities don't want them to work. Or employers also don't employ women, not because of discriminatory attitudes, but really because they don't think that women should be working. So it's all a sort of norm story, no matter which way you look at that. So that's the popular narrative. And I'm going to put a few question marks in this narrative. So let's look at first the low level question, which is something that I've been working on with Naila Kabir. We have a paper that's called Norms That Matter. And here what we find is that the main norm that explains the low level, if you focus on the norm story, is really what feminist economists call the reproductive labor, which is all the work, not just care work, but all the domestic chores that women have to do. Because in South Asia, the predominant responsibility of getting domestic chores done, it lies with the women. Either they do it themselves or they get it done. And in fact, what better place than Kerala for me to talk about this, because there's recently been an excellent film, which I'm sure everybody has seen, The Great Indian Kitchen. And if you haven't, you should, you must absolutely catch it. And that it's in tortuous details, it tells us the daily lives of women that are completely bogged down and burdened with domestic responsibilities. And because of which, even if paid work opportunities were available, women find it difficult to engage in them. However, there are three other things actually that we see in that paper. One is that women, despite all the attention to domestic chores that they have to give, they work on family enterprises, which could be farms, which could be fisheries, orchards, livestock, particularly, artisanal activities, craft, making produce and selling them. So these are all income generating activities for families, and women work on them. In fact, these activities would not be possible without the labor of women at home. Yet, when it comes to counting who works or who's counted as a worker on these family enterprises, it's the men who are counted. Women are not counted as workers. Partly they themselves discount their own contribution because of social conditioning. Partly it's the men in the family who don't count them as workers. And so when an NSS enumerator or a census enumerator comes and asks whether they are working, who's working, whether women are working, the answer to this question is typically no, that they are not working because they are not getting paid for it. But this is not unpaid care work. This is unpaid economic work, in the sense that if this work had been done by men, they would be counted. This is work that, those of us who are familiar with the system of national accounts, this is work that comes within the production boundary. The reason that it is not counted as work or employment, because it's not for pay or profit, which is the ILO definition. But if it had been for pay or profit, these activities are routine economic activities that should be counted, and these women should be counted as workers. Now, in the international literature, there's a lot of attention and discussion about unpaid care work. And indeed, that's important. That's a reproductive labor. But I think we need to also recognize that there's a lot of unpaid economic work based upon which these women should be counted as being part of the labor force, just as their male counterparts are counted, but they are not. So that's the one issue that we need to understand about measurement, which explains the low level, because women are working in economic activities, but they're not getting counted as such. Second, despite their work in domestic enterprises, as well as their predominant responsibility of domestic chores, there is a massive unmet demand for work. Of course, provided it's compatible with domestic chores, because that's something that they cannot negotiate their way out of. So overwhelming majority of women in our survey, in NSS surveys, in a whole lot of surveys, when they are asked if work were to be made available either near or at your home, would you work? This is paid employment for other employers. And women predominantly, in overwhelming majority, respond yes. So this doesn't sound like a norm story. This doesn't sound like somebody who's oppressed and being made to, sit in a cage inside the home. Women want to work in paid work, provided work is available. And in our paper, we also found actually that there is a positive intergenerational transmission, which is women in families who have seen their mothers working, or whose mothers-in-law working, and now I'm counting work as employment, not as unpaid work on family enterprises, are more likely to work. So in other words, there is a transmission of positive norms, which is if you see elder women in your family working, you are more likely to work, controlling for all other factors. So this is sort of one set of issues that I want to flag that put a question mark on this conservative social norms narrative. And in fact, you would say, okay, why do you think that women in India have to do particularly more work relative to women elsewhere? Well, guess what? They do. India and Pakistan are amongst the least egalitarian countries as far as sharing domestic chores is concerned. And this is an older data set, again, put together by Our World in Data. But if you look at even the latest Time Use Survey data 2019, you find that women put in as much as 10 times more work on domestic chores. So in Bangladesh, the situation is much better, even though it's neighboring, and it's not that much different in terms of it was, after all, the same country 75 years ago. Now, so this also makes us think about something that I'm going to come back to later, which is how do norms change? Why is it that Bangladesh is showing this big difference relative to India and Pakistan? Could it be that women's labor force participation rate increased there because of various factors, and that led to a change in norms that might have been more inegalitarian 60, 70 years ago, when their labor force participation rates were at 3% or something, so this just suggests to us the possibility that perhaps norms are not written in stone, that they can change. Now, coming to the decline in labor force. So this was the earlier part of my talk, was about the low level. Now let's look at the decline story, the decline in labor force participation rates. And this is, again, my work with Jitendra Singh, my PhD student. And here we have looked at the numbers from NSS, National Sample Survey, Employment Unemployment Surveys, as well as the periodic labor force surveys for 2017-18. And here we see what's happening to female labor force participation rates. And what, when we say outside house, basically this is a category that we have created, which is that when a woman goes out to work, outside of the home for another employer, okay? And the big, headline news in this headline sort of result in this diagram is this drastic drop between 2005 and 2010 in total female labor force participation rate rural. Okay, notice the years. It's 2005 and 2010. And it continues to decline, but the sharpest decline is happening at this point. So when we talk about, increasing conservatism in Indian society, we might want to just keep these years in mind as well. There is not a very neat correlation between the trends that we have been seeing in the last 7 years and what you see. So the rural labor force participation rate continues to decline. Okay, but notice the period of decline. Secondly, when you look at the blue line, which is the labor force participation rates outside the home, rural, which is this line over here, the levels are low, but there is no decline here. So this sort of suggests that it could be the case that the work that rural women are doing is become so fractured and so fragmented that due to various statistical reasons, and they may be working fewer hours, which is a thesis that others have done, which is it's not the numbers of women that have declined, it's really the amount of work that's getting done that's declined, and that's showing up in this decline. You know, in urban labor force participation, it also declined, but rural declined by a much sharper amount. So this is the NSS picture. Now, our work in this particular paper, the dropping out paper, that is with CMI data. And what is the advantage of CMI data? Now, CMI data is not comparable to NSS. There have been debates going on currently about the comparability, et cetera, something that I'm not going to go into. But one huge advantage of the CMI data is that it's panel data, it's longitudinal data. So and it's high frequency panel. So every individual is surveyed 3 times a year, every 4 months. Right? So we are able to track the employment status of the same individuals in quick succession. You know, so when we compare waves or months, we can see what's happening to the very same individual. So it cannot be about differences in attributes of individuals because those don't change so frequently. So in some sense, getting an understanding of what is it that is leading to this result of decline, panel data set is actually really very, very useful. And it's, as it happens, it has allowed us to notice a pattern which other data sets don't allow us to notice because they are not panel data sets. Now, CMI, the employment definition of CMI is more comparable to the daily status of NSS, not the weekly or the usual status. So that's something that to be kept in mind. So it's a much stricter definition. So were you working yesterday? Were you employed yesterday? Now, that's really the question that's getting asked. So the estimates are not comparable, but the trends are interesting. So we look at a 4-year period between 2016 and 2019, just before the COVID. I've done some work on using CMI data post-COVID, and I can talk about that in Q&A, but right now it's about pre-COVID. And that covers the demonetization period also, and I'm going to show you something quite interesting there as well. And if you look at the labor force participation rate, which of course, as all of us know, is a sum of includes employed and unemployed women, you see a decline in both urban and rural, and pretty sharp, which is a little bit of a different trend compared to NSS. Okay, because in NSS you see a sharp decline for rural women, but not so much for urban women. Also, the time period is a little bit different because this only starts in 2016. So, you know, I wouldn't spend a lot of time comparing this chart with the earlier chart, but I just wanted to show you also what we see in NSS. So this is the sort of the overall picture of what is happening to employment rates or labor force participation rates. But look at this. Now, because we are able to track the same women 3 times a year, so basically we have 12 data points on the same woman because it's 3 times a year, 4 years. So the average labor force participation rate for women in our data is about 14.5%. So what that means is that this is 14.5% of women were in the labor force in all the waves. Okay, but what we notice is that women keep entering and exiting the labor force several times over the course of these waves. Each wave is 4 months. All right. And so 44% of the women in our sample were in the labor force for at least one of the 12 waves. Right. And this is without changing the definition of employment. So it's the same strict definition that we see in CMI. But what we find is that even with that same restrictive definition, 44% of the women were in the labor force at least once over a period of 4 years. Now, and you know, there are switches. So we document from in the labor force to out of the labor force, from out of the labor force to in the labor force. So what we see in our paper is repeated entry and exit of the same women in and out of the labor force, right? So this points to another problem. It cannot be the norm story because social norms are sticky. You know, it takes time to establish norms, but then once a norm is established, it takes a long time for norms to change. They don't oscillate. You know, certainly they don't increase. You know, become tighter and looser within months. But this is something we could have observed only with panel data, and you know, CMI is the only data set that allows us to observe that. Now look at this graph, which is showing us entry rates for from this is so this is people who are out of the labor force in wave 1 entering the labor force in the next wave, right? Now you see, of course, the blue bars, the blue parts for women in every wave are higher than those for men because more women declare themselves to be out of the labor force than unemployed. Because if they were unemployed, they would still be considered a part of the labor force. But if they are not working, they are not looking for work, they are classified as out of the labor force. So everywhere in the world, women often tend to declare themselves as out of the labor force rather than saying I'm unemployed and I'm looking for work, right? So that explains these things. But what you notice is that in every wave, both men and women who were out of the labor force in the previous wave are entering the labor force. Every single wave. So what you see is a period of flux, is a phenomenon of flux, which is greater for women than it is for men. Again, it's something that we know from other, ethnographic work or field work, etc., etc. But we didn't have the data to sort of document these repeated entries and exits. Because the only panel we have before this was the IHDS panel, which is 7 years apart, and it's just 2 waves. So people have documented entry and exit based upon that, but this is a much more high frequency panel, and it picks up the repeated entry and exit in a way that the IHDS can't, just because it's further apart. Now, another reason in the literature given for women to drop out of the labor force, at least for certain parts in their lives, is the motherhood penalty. So either women drop out, or their wages go down, or they take up part-time work, etc. Now, in the West, where there's a far greater number of women who are in properly paid employment, motherhood penalty has been estimated in the form of a wage penalty. So you look at years or quarters before the birth of the child, and then years or quarters after the birth of the child, and there have been event studies that show that men actually earn a wage premium because of the fact that their families have gone up, but women earn a motherhood penalty. Now in India, because of the fact that many women do unpaid work, there's a great deal of work in the informal sector. So wage penalties are very hard because the regular wage salaried proportion of women is very, very hard to show. Also in the public sector, you cannot get a wage penalty. You can get maternity benefits, although it's a tiny segment of the labor force, but you cannot really get a wage penalty in the public sector, etc. So we thought of another way of looking at the motherhood penalty by looking at the labor force participation rates. And so what we find, so the green line are the new mothers. The orange line is the comparison group, which is women where there was no birth of a new child, in over the period. But there are some baseline differences also between the comparison group and the new mothers. So what we use is a technique called entropy balancing, where you can match the groups of new mothers and no mothers, not new mothers rather, along characteristics like age, caste, etc., etc. So there is a similar group. You create a group which is similar in all other dimensions, except the fact that one group of women has had a child in our study period, and another group of women has not had a child, right? And so the green is the comparison group, okay, which is the entropy balanced weight. And we don't actually, sorry, I think there's a mistake in the labeling here. No, sorry, it's fine. I can't see. No, it's fine. So the new mothers is the green, and the blue line is the entropy balance. Excuse me for that. And so what you see is you see the gap between the blue, which is the comparison group, entropy balanced, and the green, which is the new mothers. Or if you don't like entropy balancing, you can just look at the regular comparison, but then the groups are not strictly comparable, and you really see a level effect, which is the levels of labor force participation rates are different and they stay that way. And when you see the decline from January 16 to about August 17, that decline happens for both groups of women, not just for the new mothers. And the reasons for that I'm going to come to in another slide. Okay. Here we have new mothers, new fathers, comparison men, comparison women. And again, here you see that in some sort of a mirroring of the results that you see in the West, you see that fathers, if you call this a penalty, I mean, first of all, it's not motherhood penalty in the way that we understand motherhood penalty, because it's just that the baseline is different. So when you know that you are going to be having children, you just don't participate in the labor force, and then you stay that way, at least for 3 or 4 years. So there's a baseline difference. But for fathers, it's not even that. In fact, comparison men who are probably older have a lower labor force participation rate than the new fathers. So you see the base effect for women, but you don't see it for men. So in that sense, there is that gender gap that you see, but in a different way compared to the West. So you don't see wage penalties. You don't even see employment. It's not like employment drops drastically, but it's just the level effects. Now, there are regression results also where we have estimated coefficients. I'm not showing that, but it's there in the paper. People can look at it, and I can talk about it later on in the Q&A. Okay. Now, notice here this decline, which is happening, sort of over 2016. And what we did was we looked at, in my paper on COVID, which is not obviously a part of this paper, I find that in the first few months after the lockdown started to lift, the effect on women's employment was disproportionately larger compared to men's employment. That's another paper. And so we wanted to see what effect demonetization had on female labor force participation rate. And we take November 2016 as the cutoff, and we find dramatic effects both in rural and for urban women, showing, and for COVID you see this, for demonetization you show it. So whenever there is an economic crisis, female labor force participation already low and fractured, etc. You see a very sharp level decline. So these are fitted lines for pre and post, and fitted lines for pre and post. And so while it's a continuous decline, but you see a very clear sort of a structural break here around the demonetization month. And the reasons for that are not difficult to understand, because economic activity took a big hit, given that India's economy, is very largely informal. The proportion of informal workers, whether in organized or unorganized sector, is close to 90%. And these are workers that deal with cash, the employers deal with cash, etc. And so the withdrawal of large amounts of cash from the economy hit this work and employment really badly. Okay, now one of the key elements of the argument, of the social norms argument, is the violence against women. And the idea is that the argument that's made for India is, so I mean, hopefully by now I've persuaded you to think that perhaps it's not a norm story that's going on, right? Because women keep switching in between work and not work. There isn't really a motherhood penalty of the kind that we would expect. And when there's a crisis, you see a sudden change in females' labor force participation rates. So all this suggests that there are really sort of underlying economic factors or structural factors that are explaining this. Now, violence against women is a culprit, and indeed it's a very serious problem, not just in India, all over the world. And it's an expression of patriarchal power. It's an expression of men trying to control women with violence through necessary. But one thing about violence against women is that a large part of it, the overwhelming majority of violence against women, is perpetrated by those close to the women who are known to the women. So these are family members, relatives, friends, etc. There is street violence, but compared, when you take the sum total of violence against women, most of it is perpetrated. The majority of it comes from people known to the women, right? So when we were just trying to see when we plot this across time, what does it look like? So for example, on the left hand side, you see the green line, which is female labor force participation rate rural, and this is that period of decline. Okay, and here we have plotted crime figures from the National Crime Records Bureau. Okay, so this is rape, which is the blue line. This is assault. Okay, and this is a cruelty by husband or relatives. Okay, so in here we see possibly some correlation because there's a slight increase in cruelty by husbands and relatives and a decline in labor force participation rate. But there's certainly, we don't see a very clear correlation between the other forms of violence against women. And in fact, this is just a graph. We've also done actual, estimated the correlations. Here, we look at outside the house. Okay, so here it is outside the house rural, and it's outside the house urban. And again, the same three indicators. And here you find actually that as there's been an increase in the violence against women, which another issue about these figures is it incidents or is it reporting? I might, if I have time, I'll go into that, but let's assume it's incidents right now. And so you see in rural areas, it's really a flat curve, it's outside the home, rural is really flat, right? And so we want to, all this is, these figures in themselves are proof of nothing. All it shows is that perhaps the relationship between violence against women and female labor force participation rates is more complicated. If there is a correlationship, it's more complicated than a straightforward narrative is that there's been an increase in violence and that's pushing women inside the house. If anything, they should leave the house because the cruelty by husbands and relatives is actually increased over the period. So being indoors inside the home is not what women would want to do. And these are just some global figures. This is ratio of female to male labor force participation rates. This is number of assault cases per 100,000, rape cases per 100,000, sexual violence per 100,000, intimate partner violence per 100,000. Okay, and really you don't see, we fitted these curves, but you don't really see any dramatically apparent relationship between violence against women and female to male labor force participation rates. If anything, there's a mild increase, but I wouldn't even put that much into it, because when you look at the scatter plot, across countries, you don't really see a pattern. So while violence against women, whether inside the house or outside the house, is an extremely serious issue and has enormous implications on the well-being of women, on the mental health, physical health, all kinds of other issues, but there is no neat relationship with female labor force participation rates. That's all that we are trying to say here in this, through this graph. Okay. Now, perhaps we want to step back and look at, the demonetization chart gave us some idea of what happens when there's a crisis. My other work on COVID also shows the same thing. So let's just look at what's happening to employment relative to the increase in total working age population. So if you look at the right side panel, we've taken male and female employment from the CLEMS data set. And on the right-hand side, we've just plotted total population in the working age group increasing, and here is total employment. So the basic issue is that employment is not keeping pace with an increase in the working age population for everyone, men and women. This gap is widening here. And here it's rate of growth, so it's population rate of growth, which, by the way, because fertility is going down, is sort of plateauing and in fact starting to decline, but employment growth is declining much faster. So I think we need to focus attention away from the norms, not because norms don't matter. Of course, as I said, the norms around distribution of reproductive labor, domestic chores, all of that has to change. Sexual violence has to be brought down. So that conversation has to go on. But I think we would be barking up the wrong tree if we thought of those as aspects as the key aspects that are preventing women and men, for that matter, from being in the labor force. For some reason, my mouse is, yeah, here it is. Okay. Now, do norms change? Can they change? Even, to the extent that it's a norm story at all. Yes, they do, but they take a long time. This is weekly hours dedicated to home production in the United States from 1900 to 2005, right? So you see that men's hours on domestic work have gone up gradually over the decades. Women's hours have gone down, but the gender gap has narrowed for sure, but it's still there. Most of all, here is, over 100 years, over a century. So is it going to be the case that we have to wait for 100 years before we increase female labor force participation rates? No, because Bangladesh, right, and South Korea. So there have been countries where things have changed, in the course of a decade, because basic economic structural factors changed, and that's what changed labor force participation rate. So we shouldn't be looking at, saying, okay, now for 100 and 150 years, there's nothing we can do because norms have to change. And also norms, I mean, that's my view at least, is that norms is not, it is of course the way people think, but the way people think is shaped by their economic circumstances rather than the other way around. So it's not as though every morning men get together and say, okay, let's assert patriarchy now. Today is our day to assert patriarchy. And every single day do the same thing. And women get kept out of different arenas. No. Patriarchy as a system exists because of structural factors, right? And so it's, change in the way people think, nudges, behavioral changes, all these can play their role. I'm not doubting that. But the basic way in which people think about women and about gender parity will change only when the underlying structural factors change. So, and the gender parity in paid work, in the world of work, in the world of employment, has to be simultaneously thought of along with gender parity in the domestic domain. Okay, because it's linked, right? My paper with Naila also shows the same thing. It is linked. If there is highly unequal gender norms inside the home, then it's not going to lead to major shifts in the work norm. Okay, so how do we get started? I mean, this seems to be like a vicious circle. So where do we break it? I think we can break it at the level of the labor market, and I think that might push and drive changes in the domestic sphere. So, for example, recognizing the importance of policies that reduce the burden of domestic work, that redistribute unpaid domestic work, and there are a number of policies that can be thought of in that domain. Gender gaps in education, financial digital inclusion, legal protections for women who come to work, etc. There's a whole range, a slew of policies that we can learn from the rest of the world and institute that first. I mean, so think about pushing gender parity at the workplace, and that might have spillover or positive effects in the domestic sphere. Now, one of the features you notice when you look at an increase in female labor force participation rates globally, historically, is that a reduction in maternal mortality rate is essential, is a precondition, sort of, almost, to increasing in female labor force participation rates. And here, South Asia has inegalitarian gender norms when it comes to domestic chores. But in terms of its success in reducing the maternal mortality rate, it has achieved substantial success. India too. India has achieved a great amount of success in reducing maternal mortality. So maternal mortality has gone down, fertility has gone down, education has increased. So a lot of the preconditions that need to be met or were met in other countries for female labor force participation rates to increase we see that those in India. So I think there are several preconditions that are there already. Now the question is, what do we do? How do we use the dividend from these preconditions and push women, increase the entry of women, sorry about this, in the labor market. Now, there's a lot of literature on marriage as a deterrent to women working outside the home. The fact is that in India, marriage is nearly universal. About 98% of women, there are ever married women. So we cannot possibly have this as a policy prescription to say that first women have to stop getting married, then they can enter the labor force. Or it's only when a critical mass of women remains unmarried, then you will see a change. I don't think that can happen, or I don't think history shows us that. So in Europe and in the US, when around in the 20th century, when female labor force participation rates went up, they were driven by married women. So number of women increased, but they were married women. Okay, that's the extensive margin. Intensive margin, when you look at the hours worked in the 20th century, they increased. But in the 21st century, the intensive margin has plateaued. So hours worked by women has actually declined or plateaued. Experience is different in different countries. And so when you think of at least the intensive margin, I'm not even coming to the extensive margin, but in the intensive margin, when you think of the intensive margin, you realize that you need to, you can talk about marital norms, you can talk about gender norms of, house sharing, etc. But women could be married and still could be working outside the home, right? It's a question of gender parity. It's a question of achieving that. And so that's something that I've talked about. Preconditions, I've highlighted that again. Lowering maternal mortality rate, increasing education, lower fertility. These are three very important preconditions to increasing female labor force participation. And you do see that in India as well. And I think the story from Bangladesh, I haven't obviously done any original work here, but it makes me suspect that it's really the entry of women into the world of work, that resulted in changes in the domestic sphere, not the other way around. So I think that we would be barking up the wrong tree if we thought that first, let's let the norms of domestic work change, and then we will see an entry of women into the labor force. I don't think that's going to happen. And so I think we really need to focus on the demand for female labor. And what my work with Jitendra also shows is that it's really the demand for female labor that's irregular, that's fractured. That is the problem. There's other work by my Ashoka University colleague that shows that the technological changes in agriculture have displaced female labor in agriculture, not male labor. So 30% of the decline in rural female labor force participation rate is coming because of technological changes. So it's really, we need to focus on the demand side and not really focus on the supply side constraints about norms and violence against women, etc., important as they are to an overall discussion of gender equality. Second large point, which is linked to my, when I was talking about earlier women's work on economic enterprises, is we need to work towards better measurement. The Sonal Desai at NCER runs a pilot called the Delhi Metropolitan Area Survey, where they piloted a different way of asking the question, right? So they didn't ask who works, because the answer to that typically is that women don't work, but they asked about what is the work that the family does. And, the answer would be fisheries, agriculture, whatever. And then they said, okay, this is the work that you do. So who are the members who share in this? And there, somehow people had no problem in listing out the members of the household that did this work. And there, women were much more likely to get listed compared to the usual way of asking the question. But this is built upon recognizing that women do unpaid economic work on family enterprises. It's only when you internalize that recognition, then you're going to be able to change the way questions are asked. At the workplace, I think we don't talk enough about gender discrimination, which is employers actively discriminate against women on account of, either pregnancy, whatever, or we don't want to make special provisions for women, so it's better not to hire them. So there's overt discrimination, there's covert discrimination. There is also what is called indirect discrimination, which means that you make the same role laws for men and women, but they effectively end up. For example, if you have a 12-hour working day. Excuse me, somebody's mic is. Could you please mute your mic?
Yes, Mr. Balgopal Chandrasekhar, yes.
Thank you. So indirect discrimination would be to say, all blue-collar workers have to work 12 hours, which is anyway a violation of the older labor codes, because women can't work 12 to 14 hours in a factory. They just can't for reasons we have seen. So even though the law is not actively discriminating against women, but this is an example of indirect discrimination, which means you make the same rules for different groups of workers without recognizing that their circumstances or that some groups face structural barriers which are different from other groups. And so sometimes making the same rule ends up promoting indirect discrimination. A lot of the times it's a question of just being completely unaware, right? So when we talk to male employers, they say gender discrimination? No, not at all. They haven't even thought about it. And their usual thing is, I don't face it. Of course, they don't face it. That's the point. So we need also more sensitization and definitely stronger anti-discriminatory laws, not just about gender, but also about caste, religious discrimination, and in all other dimensions as well. So that's one thing. Then a huge bottleneck, even in the context of low demand for female labor, is transportation. So even when work exists, women are unable to access it because how do they get to work in time without being harassed and without being completely crushed in a crowd? Sanitation, some simple thing like that, which is that the number of workplaces where women, there is no separate women's toilet or not a clean enough place for women to change or go, or just menstrual health, etc., etc. Just very elementary things like that, making workplaces female friendly. And certainly larger questions of, childcare at the workplace, etc., etc. Those are, I'm not even going there. But basically the point is that you need to pay attention to making workplaces female friendly and enabling the logistical access, which is women being able to get to work and back. So at the same time, when we've seen a decline in female labor force participation rates, there has been a massive increase in the number of women who have participated in rural livelihoods projects, self-help groups. Kudumbashree is an excellent example in Kerala, whose membership just goes from strength to strength. Again, that goes a little bit counter to the narrative of the social norm story. If there was such conservative social norms holding women back, you wouldn't see them getting active in self-help groups, either running enterprises or doing other kinds of things. And, even when you think of their role as Asha Anganwadi workers, something that we saw during COVID, I think that the social norm story is much more complicated than what appears at first sight. If you compare migration, domestic interstate migration of women, most of it is for marriage-related reasons, that's correct. But the non-marriage migration of women has increased between 2001 and 2011. This is for work, this is to find work. Most of this is unregulated, it's highly hazardous, it's very risky, but women travel hundreds of kilometers to look for work because there is no work in rural areas where they live. And all of this suggests, reinforces the point that I made earlier about an unmet demand for work and women willing to make the effort to look for paid work. And finally, at the end of the day, I think the real problem is that individuals who are making decisions that affect women's lives, both in government as well as in the private sector, they are not women. So the representation of women in decision-making bodies, particularly decision-making bodies that have teeth, that have bite, that can implement, is extremely poor, both in the public sector and in the private sector and in government, in the corporate world. As a result of which, decisions get taken that affect women's lives in many ways, but over which women have very little say. And here, actually, there is a policy solution that has been worked out across the world in the form of gender quotas, both in elected positions in government as well as in the private sector. And everywhere that gender quotas have been instituted, they have found to have changed outcomes. So, again, I don't think it's a norm story here. It can change, provided we are, as a society, invested in making things change and recognizing the true barriers. And that is it from me, and I stop sharing, and I'm happy to now take questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Deshpande, for your excellent lecture and for countering the norm story for declining labor force participation rates. Now, as Professor Deshpande said, the floor is open for some questions and answers. And so you could unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Professor Deshpande. And if you are challenged by any means, you could put your questions in the chat box, and we will read that out for Professor Deshpande.
I think okay.
Can I, Professor Mani, may I?
Yes, please, Shraddha, please ask your question. Okay.
Okay.
And then it will be Mrudul.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Ashwini, for this very interesting lecture, and it's a very enormously important point that Indian labor market needs many structural changes. In the context of your lecture, I had few questions about norms and the demand for female labor force participation. Firstly, about your data on entry in and out labor market, I was wondering, did you observe any regional patterns or patterns across social positions in terms of caste and class? And this brings me to another point about labor market, which is itself so segmented, like what an entry in and out would mean for a casual construction worker, a domestic worker, or for a corporate employee is very different. So your comments on that, especially for like what I have seen in my field work, entry in and out for casual worker, it's like, okay, today I won't go for work, today I have certain responsibilities, but this does not hold true for many formerly employed women who have to, I would say, comply with the competition at workplace, and so they may be a very small part of our labor force, but still the story might be different. Secondly, about demand for female labor force. So do you have any observations about sectoral differences in this? Again, sector, like we know several sectors are already feminized, and in certain agriculture is an example where there are certain tasks task segregation according to gender. So this demand, sectoral related demand. Then about marriage, so I agree it is not about women not getting married to deal with the problem of labor force participation, but what I think, and there's I think some literature about this also, it's related to the life cycle. So what I observe that if a woman marries early, she enters into childbearing early, and that whole, I would say, it's a cumulative lack of work opportunities that enter. So it's, and also if we, I some time ago I looked at the NFHS data. So if you looked at labor force participation according to the age, so that also you reach a certain stage of your life, and then so marriage and employment there. And again, I think norms is
No, sorry,
again a very
could you complete that sentence? I didn't understand the point about age. What
age.
happens
So
with age?
So age has many ways we can look at age. So age at marriage is one of the important factors. It means for the groups of people, they will be finishing their child bearing at certain age. So do we see that this in and out is happening for a particular age group, or because they might be finishing major load of child care at that time, so that or they take up, for some women take up paid work after their children achieve age. So that is the point. And my last question, or I would say I would like you to discuss more on this about norms and paid work. One, you mentioned of the success about self-help group, but what is the another side is norms play a different role when we talk about wage or salaried employment, because there you have to go out, and the public appearance and the mobility of women makes a lot of difference. And norms and labor market, I find, are much more complicated, and I will bring an example of inadequate child care that hampers women's engagement into employment across classes. So even the maternity bill is there, even that women working in different shifts, nursing, women working as nurses, they are unable to take benefits of these things. So that also hampers them. So yeah, these were some of my queries. I'll be grateful if you can reflect on some of those.
Yeah, so we have looked at all the possible ways of, so young age, by age group, by caste categories, by religion, by state. So the paper, in fact, we had to put all the tables in the appendix because it was so many categories of women. So today I focused only on All India because I was giving a larger argument. So the paper has a huge amount of detail, occupation. We've looked at, who are the women who are more likely to be in and out, entry, exit. So the determinants of entry, determinants of exit. So the paper is huge in terms of and the patterns are, there are quite a few patterns. But I think for today's lecture, the point to focus on is the overall lesson that we are learning from the paper. Now, you disagree with a lot of what I have said, but that's my whole point, which is that we have tried to question the established wisdom in the literature by our empirical work, right? So we are engaging with empirical work by using our own empirical work at using a national level data set. And the ability to, one thing we have to always remember is this is a panel data set. It's the same women that get observed 12 times. So it's that is why when you see entry and exit, you can only see that only on panel. Otherwise, you wouldn't know which women have entered and which women have exited, because the NSS, etc., don't have retrospective questions. They assess work status at the time that the survey is done. But here, because we can make a panel, we can actually observe repeated entry and exit. Okay, so if it were a norm story, I personally don't think these things change so drastically. And even the 44% versus 14%. 14% of women were in the labor force the entire 12 waves, but 44% were in the labor force at least once in the 12 waves. So I don't know how else to explain that, especially when we look at all other factors. I'll just answer it briefly, but please, the paper is online. I can send you the link. Please do read that, and then we can discuss further.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go read the paper and read.
I just wanted to ask, hello, Ashwini first.
Mridul, hi.
No, my two things I wanted to say. One was I'm very happy you're emphasizing demand and the gender-friendly infrastructure for women to be able to work. That's very, very important. I think that's a good thing to emphasize. But I have another question on the other side, the supply side. It seemed a little surprising to me when you see, we're talking about norms. Now, the norms don't stop you from going out to work so long as you can do your household work.
Yeah.
They're not so oppressive. You see, I mean, they are oppressive, but they don't accepting
Yeah,
for
but
a
you
very
need to
small.
get,
No,
you
accepting
need
for
to
a
get work, no,
no.
be.
I'm saying whatever work, there's unmet demand for work, unmet, all this is together with the norms. Of course, the norms are existing, but women still want to work because they think they can get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, finish off their household work, and they go out to work. And there's not much of a problem. Okay, now that's one thing. So norms do play a very important role. It changes the women's, the household type of style of working if they want to go out to work. The second thing I was very surprised about, you were mentioning about how there's an when you're talking about the level of work, then you were saying that there is an underestimation because you're not really counting women who are helping in the enterprises. But that's the whole volume of which is not adequately captured. But you have that unpaid family labor which is working on the enterprises. So that is not completely being left out. But at the same time, there are these other women who are working in the 9293 category. Those who are housewives.
Exactly.
That doesn't get captured. You see, that doesn't get captured at all. Okay.
Yeah.
So that is what I want. Was wondering how you missed out these two facts. One is that the norms do not stop you from working if you can manage both. But the point is that it becomes very difficult for women to do that sometimes. Okay. The other thing is sometimes the wage disparities also play a very important role. If you do not get enough, for instance, in Kerala, if you do not get enough for what you have been educated for, you may, trade off being at home, looking after the family rather than going out for work. So that wage disparity also plays a very important role in the whole thing. And the third thing, as I said, the people who are being underestimated, if you look at the data, you can say that it is not adequately captured, but you can't say that that category is not there in the PLFS and NSSO and whatever it is. Quickly, I'll say the other thing. Just one more thing, since you mentioned the Great Indian Kitchen, I don't know, you must have seen the paper which came out comparing that young woman with the Kudumbashree women. Have you seen that paper? It's a very interesting paper, how that girl walks out of marriage, but how come Kudumbashree women have been able to negotiate, remain in marriage, go out and do their self-help group work. So how do you look at agency? How do you conceptualize agency in such a situation? These are the sort of things which immediately came to my mind, but it was a wonderful paper, Ashwini, and please do give us the link, okay?
Yeah, thanks, Mridul. So first, it was a very brief summary of one paper and a slightly longer summary of another paper. The 92-93 is very much discussed in my paper with Naila. But today was not about that. Today was about decline. And I'm using social norms in the way they get used in the literature. Precisely what my paper with Naila, the title of that paper is Norms That Matter. So we are saying that the norms of being predominantly responsible for domestic chores, they do matter. They make a difference. I mean, they make it harder for women. They'll have to get up at 4 and whatever, they'll do it. But that's harder. And my paper with Jitendra is showing that work is not always available, even if women are willing to make that adjustment. That is why there's an unmet demand, that they would like to go. So 92-93 category doesn't get counted in the labor force category, but I have analyzed 92-93 separately. Also, in my paper with Naila, we have similar questions to 92-93, and we have shown that when you count that, the labor force participation rate goes up hugely. So I'm very aware of 92-93, and that paper, it's just in 1 hour, how much can I talk about? So I wasn't able to go into that 92-93 whole discussion, and I also wasn't sure of how many people want to know that level of detail, but I'm happy to share that paper as a third. Wage disparities. I have another paper, which I didn't talk about at all today, which is about wage gaps and the unexplained part of the wage gap, which is seen as a discriminatory penalty towards women. I didn't talk about that today, but in fact, when I was talking about employer discrimination, that was at the back of my mind. It was a question of showing some new results, which were possible because of this entry and exit thing. And so I decided to focus on a few things in my 1 hour, but absolutely yes to everything, Mridul, that you've said. And that's why I talked about the self-help groups. I haven't seen this particular paper, but the point is that if norms were so oppressive, you wouldn't see women going out into the self-help groups. at all. And you wouldn't see an increase in female migration for reasons other than marriage, but you do. So what's going on? It does point to the demand side story. And despite whatever norms there are, women will work when they can. That's the whole point. That's what my paper, that entry and exit, that's exactly what it shows. Thanks.
Just one second. No, I'm not denying that there's a demand side. Definitely there's a demand side. And I'm glad that you're emphasizing the demand side. I'm saying that norms also play an equally important role, because if they do get work, it has to, it has to be enabling. They should be able to go out for work. So,
Yeah,
it's very difficult to decide which is playing the more important role from my point of view. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. No, so in the presentation, I did talk about transportation. I mean, there's a whole range of issues related to women's work, which is about agency, empowerment. We haven't gone into the question of, when women earn a wage, even when they earn a wage, like salaried women, how much control do they have? How much autonomy? I mean, so there's a whole range of it. So this talk was not about all facets of gender discrimination, to be sure, so, otherwise it would be too superficial. So I decided to focus on a few key aspects, and I absolutely take your point. On norms, I don't know whether we are talking about the same thing, but I have explained what I understand by the norms story as it's being talked about in the international literature. And that's what I'm contesting.
Okay.
So,
okay. I rest.
No. We don't have to rest. I mean, we can have different opinions also. So that's
I'm just joking.
acceptable. Yeah.
Now, Professor Devika has a question. She has put that question in the chat box.
Oh, I'm not reading chats, please.
Okay, I can read that out for you. Devika, can you ask the question yourself, or should I read it out? I think she wants me to read it out.
Okay.
I would like to know how we define norms. Isn't it the case that the assignment of domestic tasks and childcare majorly to women in South Asia are unguarded by norms, cultural norms that sanction public-private divide, mapping it on the male-female divide? I mean, the celebration of motherhood and marriage as the true fulfillment of womanhood is pervasive, isn't it? That's all. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, of course. So Devika, that's why we, that paper with Naila, which I think Jitendra has put a link. I don't know. I'm not being able to see. It's happening very quickly. There are norms that matter, but the literature, at least amongst economists, maybe, I think we are slightly talking at cross purposes, because maybe I'm conditioned by what I see in the economics literature, arguments by the World Bank, IMF, even the magazine Economist, which had its cover, where women were shown as, covered in a so I am reacting really to that. Is that a question?
Mr. Ravi D, would you mind muting yourself? Okay, I think.
So Devika, I'm really reacting to this, to sum it up in one sentence. If I could sum up the norms argument as I hear it in one sentence from the economics community, it's like the Saudi Arabiaization of India in some sense, right? I mean, this is now being written about a lot, which is LFPR in India is now lower than in Saudi Arabia, things like that. So it's this more or less complete immurement of women and the pervasiveness of sexual violence that either prevents women from going out, or that women don't want to go out because they don't want to, be subjected to violence, or the community doesn't allow them to go on. It's very strict controls over women's mobility, which of course happens. I'm not denying that at all. But when you look at the labor force participation rates, when you look at the aggregate data, do you see a statistical correlation, more than a correlation, a causation, that an increase in these factors has caused a decrease in labor force participation rates? I'm unable to see that. As far as the housework norms are concerned, they have been there for decades. That is what, in fact, causes these low levels. But we are talking about the decline in the last 15 years. Where is the data that shows that in the last 15 years, there has been a significant increase, either in the burden of domestic chores or reproductive labor or attitudes towards motherhood or whatever, all of these things. Where is that in relation to the decline period? The low levels, yes, that's a different. That's why I started by saying that there are two issues that are seen often together, but they are slightly distinct, which is low level and decline. I just don't see the data that shows these two together or one causing the other, you know. So yeah, that would be my argument. Absolutely no quarrel about recognizing the particularly pernicious ways in which patriarchy in India keeps women subjugated or in their place, etc. But at the data level, I don't see. That's why I showed all those graphs. You know, even just visually, forget about doing any regressions. Just even when you plot the numbers, you don't see that association that people talk about. So I'm really reacting to that literature rather than saying that. Of course, there are norms that are regressive. I mean, all of us face it and talk about it. But that's not the point.
Yes, thank you, Ashwini. Now, any further questions from the floor?
I mean, also,
I just want to ask one more question. I just want to
yes,
ask one more.
of course.
You know, the international comparison that you were telling us, you know, how the participation rates of women went up, even married women. You see, one of the most, I think, triggering effect was of huge reduction in household work. You know, they had all these equipments and everything that you could do household work with, childcare. All these things must have mattered for them to come out of the households, you see. So that data probably is available there. We don't have that data. We don't have data which shows us how many creches are there, how are they increasing over time, you know, how many community kitchens are there, how are they increasing over time, can we link it to workforce participation? We don't have the data. So how can you ever be able to establish that, you see? You won't be able to establish.
I mean, in the West, there has been some work which shows which came first.
Huh?
And so what came first? Did the domestic gadgets and labor lightening initiatives come first, or the labor force participation increase first? So I mean,
I don't. You tell me. You tell me.
I think the other way around. So yes, the women entered the labor force that propelled the introduction and adoption of these practices that further facilitated labor force. The only countries that are exception to this are the socialist countries, where at a much lower level of economic development, governments took the decision that women will work outside the home and various things like the kitchens in China, etc., etc. Those were exceptional.
Yeah,
But in the Western world, because of the world wars, and by the way, the Spanish flu also was a big that epidemic, because there was mortality was so high that women had no option but to go into the workforce, because the earning members basically died because of extreme widowhood and the world wars. And the adoption of labor-saving devices and workplace being gradually, even now there are issues about workplaces not being female-friendly now, but whatever it is, that all that happened later. So I think that's why I was saying that in India, if we want to change it, maybe the government can start by establishing these practices before, because we can learn from history. So we don't need to go through the same chain that the Western world went to, and the socialist world, we are not there, and that's not happening anytime soon. So we might as well think about what policy interventions could propel women, ease the burden of the reproductive labor.
Yeah.
So that, I think, has to be a major policy focus. But for that, we need to be sympathetic to the idea that men and women are equals and they deserve. If some woman doesn't want to go outside and work, that should be her prerogative. But if a woman wants to go outside and work, conditions have to be enabling, my only point about norms is that is not going to come because of a change of heart. It's going to come as a result of policy.
Yeah.
It's not like one day the men are going to get up and say, oh, we were treating our women very badly. From today, please go out and work. That's not going to happen.
No.
It happens. Nowhere in history has it happened.
Policy is very sympathetic to enabling environment in Kerala, by the way. Policy is very sympathetic to creating creche, elderly care centers, all sorts of things, community kitchens. So that way, I agree. But what I was thinking of was that happened at a very fast rate outside. No? it happened very rapidly, the increase in participation rates. So that means the demand also must have been there in
The
some
economy
ways.
is also growing, no, massively.
Yeah,
So
the economy was
India,
growing.
in India now we have a crisis of growth. Even when we were growing, that time also the female demand for female labor was not rising, and now we have a crisis of growth at the national level. You know, where is since 2014, where has been the rate of growth? You know, so I mean, even if we thought growth will lift all boats or tides or whatever, where is the growth now? It's so I think we have also bigger. That's why I showed that other graph towards the end which talked about jobless growth for everyone. So I think that's a larger crisis that we are staring at. Anyway, there are many other issues that I didn't touch upon, but so I think we have a lot to learn from Western economic history. But I think the one thing that we learned is norms changed after women went into the labor force, not before. It's not like norms changed and then women started going out to work. That's my only point.
Yeah. Sunil, can I ask a small question?
Yes, please, Nagaraj.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ashwini, this is
Hi,
Nagaraj.
Nagaraj.
Hi. Ashwini, this which came first when you talked about? I think you see the male unemployment declined rapidly first. I mean, if you again in a Lewisian fashion, it's basically the increasing growth in the West led to absorption of male labor, and then that gradually pushed women into workforce. And of course, the specific factors you mentioned about Second World War are right. But I think when there's some sort of a sequential, if I'm not mistaken, where this is kind of a Lewisian view. Look, first, the male unemployment got exhausted, then female were drawn into the labor force. I mean, is there any evidence of that?
This is what I'm working on right now, so I don't have very clear answers. I'm just started reading, but yeah, I mean, I'll keep that in mind, and I'll read more and investigate this.
Yeah, again, I mean, you may just now casually mentioned about the socialist countries. In fact, socialist countries, because they had a policy of employment, and that pushed everybody out of homes into workplace. I mean, whether you take Soviet Union or later China. Okay, so it is the labor demand. I mean, whatever way the political regime, it is the labor demand which pushed first men got absorbed into the labor market, then women gradually got into it. There is a certain logical sequence there.
Maybe, but I think that it's certainly in China. I don't know enough about Soviet Union, but certainly in China, the slogan that Mao gave about women holding up half the sky, the community kitchens were a huge reason why women could go to work, because they didn't have to cook anymore, because they could get cheap food at the workplaces. And so this tradition of not eating lunch at home, even now in China, when you go, people don't eat lunch at home because there are just very affordable and good places to eat, and that was started really, so there was an explicit goal of gender equality, I think, which now is getting diluted to a certain extent, but in the beginning there was, I think.
Okay,
we can talk about this.
The other thing is, about the measurement of female employment. You see, I mean, I have not suppose you take a large metropolis like Bombay. I think, women do lots of, I would say, part-time work of various kinds, just for survival. It is not not so much to get the best job, but to keep themselves engaged, productively engaged, they get some supplementary income. And I think if you go to any slums in Bombay, which consists nearly half of the population, they all do some most labor-intensive jobs, which I don't know whether NSS really captures that at all. In fact, I wonder if, because I remember some MA students did some field work in the locality where we were living, and almost every household, women do assembling of pens or assembling of bindis. All of them do work all the time just to supplement. But I wonder whether the NSS captures that employment.
Yeah, so the thing is that measurement is a huge issue about women's work. As you rightly say, you see these numbers and you see visually women working, it just doesn't match, So there's been a lot of work on measurement, including, my paper with Naila also, we tried to measure it differently. But again, you need to believe that it's not being measured properly. You need to have that attitude. Only then you will measure it properly. Because it's
Okay.
not formal paid work, the kind of work they do, it sort of falls.
No, sorry, this is formal paid work. I'm talking about formal paid work. Because I'll tell you, in Bombay, in fact, the slums of Bombay, Santosh Nagar, where, which is close to IJITR, they do, in fact, things like assembling of bindis. You have women put this bindi. They have to put on a little piece of paper. Okay, all that, or say assembling of buttons, stitching of buttons, say for jeans, okay, or some bangles, just packing of the bangles into
Home-based
packets
work,
of
yeah.
10.
Yeah.
See, all this labor-intensive parts is done in households, in slums, in big cities like Bombay.
Yeah.
In fact, one can see, trucks coming there, giving them work, and evening taking the work back. I mean, this is something which one can observe the labor process.
Yes.
But I wonder whether the NSS or any field work, the individual scholars have captured some of this.
I mean, there are.
This is paid work. This is not unpaid work. This is paid work.
I understand that. But I'm saying that there are surveys of home-based work which showed slightly different picture than what NSS survey shows. But what I'm saying is a larger point, which is measurement of women's work does suffer from a lot of deficiencies. And not just in India, everywhere.
Everywhere.
In India, it might be more, but everywhere, women's work is undercounted, and particularly in developing countries.
Right.
So measurement is a huge issue for sure.
Oh, okay. I mean, sorry, just Sunil, I have question. Time for one more question, or is it up? Can I ask one?
Yes.
You can go to the first graph of yours where they show a sharp decline between 2005 and 2010, and you have three other graphs which don't show the three corresponding. I mean, I can't see the connection between them.
No.
I mean,
So that is NSS.
So
that is NSS, and then what the other graph, this paper with Jitendra is based on CMI data. So I was.
No, the first one, the first slide you showed, first graph.
It's from NSS.
NSS data. Would you be able to show it?
Sure.
No, not this one. First one. First graph. First one.
This one?
No, the first one. This one. This one. First one.
This is one. Yeah.
No, not. Next one. Where is this one? This one. The red one, it shows the total for female.
Yeah, rural total.
The other ones are components of it. Do they add up? I mean,
no. So this is the red one is rural total. The green one is urban total. So this is the usual way in which the work is shown. These are subsets. So the maroon one is a subset of the green one.
Okay.
And the blue one is a subset of the red one.
But see, because these are all flat, whereas where does the sharp decline in between 2005 and 2010 in the rural?
Yeah, so basically, what this is showing is that women who work not outside the home, they are the ones who showed the biggest decline. Their counting of work showed the biggest decline.
Who are not working outside homes.
Yeah.
I mean, they started working at home then.
At home means on family enterprises. It could not be literally at home. It could be
okay, yeah, right.
farm or whatever.
I follow.
Yeah.
Okay, this was little. I mean, I could not figure out that.
Yeah.
Does it show that U-shaped? No, this is not. Or this is the point.
You don't see the U-shape. Only in education you see the U-shape.
Kannan made this point about. Kannan made. I don't know, but I was just trying to figure out this in the larger context of debate about female. Remember, there's about so people like Rangarajan argued it's a U-shaped curve, whereas Kannan showed it the distress employment.
Yeah, so U-shape.
I was wondering.
Yeah, I don't see U-shape. Only in education you see a slight U-shape, which is labor force participation rates of the illiterate women and highly educated women. They are higher than the middle educated women. So you see a U-shape across. You see a U-shape across education. To a certain extent, you see a U-shape across. If you get asset information on assets or something, like in my paper with Naila, we see a kind of a U-shape. if you can divide households into asset quartiles or something like that. But over time, I don't see the U-shape.
Okay, I mean, I need to think about it. Okay, fine. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Sunil, on that.
Yes, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of the Foundation Day lecture by Professor Ashwini Deshpande. It was such an interesting lecture. It stimulated a lot of discussion. And her collaborator, Mr. Jitendra Singh, has put the link to their joint paper in the chat box.
Yeah.
So if someone is interested, they could
Please take a
click on it and download it immediately.
Yes.
And I thank Professor Ravi Kanpur also for attending the whole lecture and being present. It is so kind of him to have woken up so early.
Yes.
And I congratulate both Albert Abraham and Tejesh Mukherjee for winning these prestigious prizes. And thanks again to Professor Deshpande for sparing her valuable time. And we look forward to hosting her here at the center itself next year. And thanks everyone for joining us. And all CDS lectures are open to anyone. And you could find the details of these lectures and the links to the lectures itself on our program calendar, which is on cds.edu. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Just wanted to thank you, Ashwini.
Thanks, Mridul. It was great to see you. Great to see you, Ravi. Nagaraj, I couldn't see you, but it was great to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. I kept it.
Yeah.
Ah.
Bye.
Thanks everyone. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ravi. And bye-bye.